As some legal representatives will have gathered, or better still, have been told, we've had technical problems which have emerged over lunchtime. I'm sorry we've lost half an hour, but there we are. Good afternoon, Mrs. Guthrie. I'm sorry you've been delayed, and I appreciate you've got other things to do today, but it's as a result of technical problems, and technical problems are sometimes not just solvable immediately, but my apologies. Mr. McGregor.
Thank you. I'd like to go on now and pick up a matter that you address at paragraph 182 of your witness statement, and it's your attendance at the Ffield course between the 7th of July and the 12th of July 2019. Can you just explain in broad terms, what was the Ffield course and why were you there?
So the Ffield course was a residential course into aspects of engineering and infection control in the healthcare built environment. It's provided through the healthcare. I want to say healthcare improvement. It's not healthcare. It's the Hospital Infection Society and Public Health England. It covers a range of topics from including ventilation, medical device decontamination, hospital laundries, and other aspects of engineering that might relate to healthcare. It's provided by experts in the field, so Professor Peter Hoffman and Malcolm Thomas, who's one of the lead authors of SHTM 0301. It's delivered using a combination of classroom learning and practical experience. So at Ffield, there are essentially there are ventilation systems and operating theatres that allow you to understand and see physically ventilation systems and understand how to undertake tests and looking at performance, and similarly aspects of decontamination.
So yourself and some of your colleagues just happened to be at the Ffield course in July after the issues of non-compliance with SHTM 0301 are identified at the RHCYP, is that correct?
Yes, so we'd arranged to go to that course earlier in the year. It'd been identified as something that would be beneficial given the emerging issues and understanding that ventilation and infection control was something that, as an infection control service, we might be asked more about.
And while you were at the course, did you stay in touch with Dr. Inverarity in particular?
Yes.
And did you have discussions with him about the emerging issues at the RHCYP?
So we had some limited conversation, either by text, email, or possibly a couple of phone calls, because the actual learning environment, there were quite busy days that ran from 9 in the morning till about 8:30, 9 at night. But we did correspond on a number of issues, yes.
Thank you. And if I could ask you to have in front of you, please, Bundle 13, Volume 8, page 591, please. 591, please. And the context of this email chain is effectively there had been concerns raised by clinicians over the possibility of switching from balanced or negative pressure towards positive pressure. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And can you just summarise in your own words, what were your understanding of the concerns being raised by clinicians?
So I understand that the 4-bedded rooms had been provided to provide balanced or slightly negative pressure in response to concerns about cohorting patients with the same infection. And as part of the conversation in early July about bringing the unit to a point of compliance with SHTM 0301, which would require 10 air changes and 10 pascals of positive pressure between patient bedrooms and adjoining spaces, the clinicians, I think, had expressed some concern based on their understanding of the importance of the pressure differential between patient bedrooms and other spaces. And so there had been a meeting arranged with Donald and other members of the infection control team to explore those concerns and to try and provide both a rationale and reassurance about why we considered a compliant design to the SHTM to be safe.
And again, the inquiry will hear from Dr. Inverarity next week, but in his witness statement, he says, effectively, if you're cohorting infectious children, there's nothing inherently wrong about doing balanced or negative pressure, and there's nothing wrong about doing positive pressure. There's simply different ways of trying to achieve the same outcome. Is that your understanding?
Yes. I think pressure is only one component, or the pressure differential is only one component of how you manage that risk and what it is the ventilation is actually designed to do in that context.
And if we look to Bundle 13, Volume 8, page 591, and we see that there's the text beginning, any views from Ffield, please. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then final paragraph, approximately 5 lines up, there's a sentence beginning, the current design of balanced or slightly negative. Do you see that?
Yes.
It says the current design of balanced or slightly negative 4-bedded rooms, deviation from SHTM 0301, seems to have arisen from clinical teams rightly wanting to cohort patients out with a potential cohorted area, and so much of this concern is to convince them that this is still possible with an SHTM 0301 compliant design. Thanks, my brain is fried. Do you see that?
Yes.
So was this quite a complex issue in terms of the discussions that you were having with Dr. Inverarity at this time in relation to what should be done?
So I think I'm not sure complex is maybe the right word. I think it was really just seeking a second opinion, perhaps from Ffield, that what was being presented and our interpretation of what's contained within the SHTM was correct, and the rationale we were providing to clinicians to explain why that would be safe. I think it was really just to seek an objective and independent expert view on that, in the same way that we might seek a second opinion on complex matters of a medical nature.
And did you have any discussions while at Ffield with either Peter Hoffman or Malcolm Thomas about this issue?
Yes, we did.
And could you just summarise, what did you discuss with them and what did they tell you?
So as part of the discussion around ventilation, we put forward as a situation where we had, in a critical care environment, a multi-bedded room. So exactly the scenario we had in Edinburgh, and whether, and really just seeking to understand why positive pressure would be considered appropriate and safe as opposed to balanced and negative, given that for single rooms and what the SHTM is asking for is 6 air changes in balanced or slightly negative. And I think just seeking to understand which would be preferable and the rationale for positive pressure being acceptable. And so that led to a bit of discussion. And so Professor Hoffman, I think, really confirmed what Donald had been summarising. And I think principally part of the issue in Edinburgh really had arisen because I think there was very much a focus on the pressure differential between the rooms, so from the bedroom out into a corridor area, rather than a consideration of the air change rate and the mitigation that would provide around airborne contamination. And I think a failure to recognise that, so that provides dilution of room air. And I think perhaps a misconception that if air is moving from the bedroom out to the corridor, that the removal of that air is entirely dependent on that pathway, and that the air is removed in the corridor, where actually what's being provided within a compliant design is that you have both supply and extract. So what you have is dilution of the room air by virtue of the air change rate. So it's being actively removed from the room within the room, and that then anything that's contained in the air as it moves from one space to another will be at very low level. And I think the other consideration that really, or the other aspects that hadn't been considered at that time, was the additional mitigation provided by virtue of a closed door. So you have physical segregation of patients, and we did discuss at Ffield the closed door adding, and Professor Hoffman advising potentially up to 80% of that airborne, anything that remains in the air would be essentially stopped by the door. And the other consideration then is that the physical distance in itself between patient beds, and in a scenario whereby patients with infection are in a 4-bedded room, there is a considerable distance physically between those patients through a closed door, through a corridor, and into another room where other patients might be protected. So I think it was really just trying to, so that was the scenario we discussed, and he confirmed that that was a safe and indeed appropriate provision.
And was there any discussion around about whether balanced and negative with 4 air changes per hour, whether that would be a safe way of cohorting patients?
From memory, I don't recall having that precise conversation, because I think by this point in July, the overall direction of travel in Lothian, as I recall, was towards a compliant design. So we weren't seeking to confirm whether 4 was or wasn't safe.
Thank you. And we see really just what you've told the inquiry summarised there, Bundle 13, Volume 8 at page 591, from Jennifer Poyner. Who was Jennifer Poyner?
So Jennifer Poyner was one of the microbiology specialist registrars trainees, and there were 2 microbiology registrars, myself and Sarah from Lothian, attending.
Thank you. And we see that she says in the email, overall with this one, we think it's not really an issue. The fact that there is a door that can be closed on the 4-bed room will in itself reduce infection spread by 80%. Is that what Peter Hoffman had told you at the course?
Yes, and I did check my handwritten notes from the course, so that's what I've annotated in the notes of the discussion.
Thank you. And it continues, changing to a negative balanced pressure facility in that room area will not necessarily add anything. Do you see that?
Yes.
Thank you. And did that come to be really the consensus view between clinicians, estates, infection prevention and control, that if you comply with the SHTM 0301 guidance, that would be safe for the cohorting of infectious children within the critical care department?
Yes.
And if we just look to Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 316. Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 316. We see an email of the 11th of July 2019 from Janice McKenzie to a range of individuals. You're copied into that email. Do you see that?
Yes.
So Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 316. Second page paragraph. Following much discussion and looking at a range of different scenarios related to the patient groups they will be caring for and the requirement for the ability to cohort patients with the same infection, the consensus is that the requirements of SHTM 0301 in relation to ventilation within a critical care unit will provide a safe ventilation design in conjunction with the design of the paediatric intensive care unit and good staff practice to achieve best outcomes for patients. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the inquiry's heard evidence already that effectively what NHS Lothian did was to implement a high-value change notice, which changed the ventilation parameters for critical care to positive pressure and 10 air changes per hour. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
And were you involved in a series of risk assessments that were undertaken in relation to the clinical spaces within the new hospital after that change notice was put in place?
Yes, I was.
And can you just explain in your own terms, what were you and your colleagues doing after that agreement is put in place to make sure that the new hospital is going to be safe for patients when they enter it?
So specifically in relation to critical care or the wider hospital?
I think specifically in relation to critical care.
So I think in relation to critical care, our input was really, so we were involved in the design workshops for High Value Change 107 and latterly in terms of the validation of that system. So I think, again, just taking it through essentially a scribe process to a point of completion. I can't recall doing a specific risk assessment for critical care with regards to ventilation after that high value change work had been completed, but we did complete a risk assessment around ventilation for other parts of the hospital prior to occupation.
Okay. And HAI Scribe Stage 4, was that completed?
Yes, so the HAI Scribe 4s were completed for all areas of the hospital prior to occupation.
And in terms of each space of the hospital, did you effectively sit down with the designers and go through a line-by-line review of the new design?
Yes, so that was a bit further on, and we looked at the ventilation provision within the environmental matrix against the standards specified within SHTM 0301, what had been measured or demonstrated as part of a validation exercise, and where either what had been designed or what was being provided deviated from SHTM 0301 to give a view from an infection control point of view whether we felt that constituted a risk in any way, shape or form. So it was essentially a line-by-line review of every single room in the hospital, including office spaces and other non-clinical spaces.
And if I could ask you to look to Bundle 13, Volume 7, page 152, please. This is a document headed up NHS Lothian Infection Prevention Control Team Review of Suitability of the Performance of Redesigned Ventilation Systems in RHCYP DCN March 2021. Do you see that?
Yes.
What was this document?
So this related to the emergency department.
And if we perhaps look on to page 153, see the bold heading, Paediatric Intensive Care. Paediatric design changes relating to high value change 107. It says all clinical bed space areas to have a minimum of 10 air changes per hour and be at 10 pascals positive pressure. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then we see the IPCT assessment. All bed spaces in multi-occupancy bays and single rooms now achieve SHTM 0301 criteria for critical care for a pressurised environment of 10 pascals positive pressure with a minimum of 10 air changes per hour. You see that?
Yes.
And then if we look on to page 154, see that there's a bold heading, Paediatric Haematology Oncology Ward Lochranza. And again, it's relating to high value change notice 107, all clinical bed space areas to have a minimum of 10 air changes per hour and be at 10 pascals positive pressure. And the IPCT assessment is all bed spaces in multi-occupancy bays and single rooms now achieve the SHTM 0301 criteria for a ward where neutropenic patients are managed over a pressurised environment of 10 pascals positive pressure with a minimum of 10 air changes per hour. You see that?
Yes.
And if we look to the bottom of page 155, we see the assessment was completed by yourself and Dr. Donald Inverarity. Do you see that?
Yes.
After all of the reviews that you'd undertaken, this review, stage 4 HAI Scribe, were you completely satisfied that the critical care wards in the new hospital provided a safe and effective environment for the treatment of patients?
Yes, I was.
I'd just like to take one step back and ask you to look at a generalised risk assessment that was completed in July 2017 and then reviewed in January 2018. That's at bundle 6 and at page 14, please. My understanding is within your statement you say that at the time you're working on the project, this wasn't a document that you'd seen, but you've come to see it subsequently in terms of your involvement. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
Because would this be completed initially? So it's completed in the summer of 2017, refreshed in the January of 2018. That's at a point when I think you describe yourself as really being at arm's length to the project. It's Jeanette Richards that's really providing the IPC function for the project. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Now we see that it begins, if you look just under subject of assessment, consider task or environment, it says bedroom ventilation design in 4-bedded rooms does not meet the recommendations of SHTM 0301 as the current design has the 4-bedded rooms being positive pressure. Do you see that?
Yes.
The inquiry's heard evidence from Janice McKenzie, who was involved in completing the general risk assessment. She said that's not a judgment that clinicians could make because it wasn't really for the clinicians to work out how the technical ventilation parameters would or wouldn't comply with SHTM 0301. Should I understand from the evidence that you gave this morning that you wouldn't see that judgment as being something that Jeanette Ray or Richards could make as the IPCN involved in the project?
So I think Jeanette would and could have provided a view about what the SHTM specified for general ward environments versus critical care environments. I think that's a reasonable expectation, and that's not specifically related to aspects of design. That's at the point of compliance or not.
So you think Jeanette Ray Richards would have been able to offer a view as to whether it should be balanced or negative as opposed to positive pressure for critical care rooms?
So obviously I wasn't involved in this conversation, but I would be confident, and from the correspondence and the contact that I had with Jeanette at the time around ventilation matters, Jeanette was very clear. Any question she was ever asked around ventilation, she referred the project team back to SHTM 0301 and would have been aware of Table A1 and the parameters that are laid out in that.
Because it's just, if we look to the bottom of that box, it says the risk assessments have been discussed with the children's CMT and infection control and prevention, who've confirmed that not having the ability to cohort patients is not acceptable from a patient safety perspective. So it seems that there is input saying you need to be able to cohort patients and the ventilation solution needs to be designed to accommodate that. Is that your understanding of what the IPC input would be?
So there's a statement in the risk assessment to say that it's been discussed and agreed, but the only record or the only reference to this discussion that I can find any evidence of is in the email correspondence between Ronnie Henderson and Jeanette in around, I think, the January of 2017, where this question was specifically asked. So I can't say with any confidence at this distance what question was specifically asked of Jeanette or what she was being asked to agree or endorse, or how that was framed, because there is lots of reference to this, and I think infection control having signed off or advised on this in correspondence and in documents that, to the best of my knowledge, we weren't copied in and had no visibility of. So I don't know, in terms of when it said infection control and prevention, whether that relates to Jeanette. My assumption would be as the link for the project, that would be likely, but whether this alludes to conversation with anybody else in the team. But certainly we as a kind of senior team, and I certainly had no awareness of this and can find no record of this ever having been shared.
Because you hadn't seen it, and from what you tell us within your witness statement, if someone had come to you and said, we want cohort patients within critical care, and they'd said, we want to do that using balanced or negative pressure, your response would be, that's not right, the guidance says positive pressure. Is that correct?
Yes, but I think there's a step before that, and I would want to understand from the point of view of infection control why a cohort for infection control purposes was being requested, because that wouldn't be the default position, and it certainly wouldn't be the default position within a critical care environment.
And if we just look to the top of the document, bundle 6, page 14, we see the individuals completing this assessment. It's Janice McKenzie, the clinical director, Dorothy Hanley, RHSC commissioning lead, Fiona Hallcrow, the project manager. We don't see this risk assessment being signed off from anyone from IPC, do we?
No.
Do you think that is potentially a flaw in the system that existed at least until the revised guidance within SHTM 0301/2022, which creates the ventilation safety group?
So I'm not sure if it's a particular flaw in the guidance rather than perhaps a weakness in the process to derogate from guidance, and the process for evidencing the decision making around that, I think would be probably my assessment.
Because in fairness, as I understand you, what you're saying now is people are saying, well, IPC signed off on this, but you then look back through your records and it's very difficult to work out what they mean by IPC signed off on this. And there's not any crisp record of what IPC either was or was not agreeing to.
Correct, because I'm not clear what question or how the question was posed to infection control, and it's not uncommon for information or advice to be then either misinterpreted, and I don't mean maliciously, but either misinterpreted or miscommunicated by people who don't have subject matter expertise. I don't think that's any different to any other technical or specialist area of practice. If you're a non-specialist in the area, I think sometimes communicating a conversation or a discussion, it can be easy for that to then be taken slightly out of context or misinterpreted in some way. And I have no evidence to say that's what's happened here, but that is my experience.
Thank you. And if we could just look to bundle 13, volume 7, please, at page 160. Bundle 13, volume 7, page 160. And you see just about a third of the way down, there's an email from Donald Inverarity to Tracy Gillies dated the 9th of July 2019. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we look over the page onto page 161, I won't read out the body, but it's recording, I think, a discussion that you had with Jeanette Ray Richards that had been reported to Donald Inverarity. And if we look at the first full sentence on page 161, it says, additionally, she spoke with Lindsay last Friday and confirmed she had not been involved in any decision to reduce air changes per hour to below that outlined in SHTM 0301. Do you see that?
Yes.
If you remember that discussion, could you just broadly explain to the inquiry what discussions you were having with Jeanette Ray at that time?
So Jeanette had retired by this point in time, and so the conversation was really to understand, given her involvement in the project, whether she could provide us with any more information around the decision making, so the timing of the decision, who might have been involved in any decision, and where, if any, we might locate any risk assessment pertaining to those decisions. And I think just to confirm from my perspective as the lead nurse, I wasn't aware and hadn't been made aware as part of Jeanette's handover as she moved into retirement of any kind of significant issues around ventilation, other than the ones that she had previously communicated around, for example, CT air change conversations. And Jeanette was very diligent usually in providing an SBAR, a short summary report of the situation. And those were typically the types of things that she would refer on to myself and Donald for comment on. And Jeanette also, typically with a query about ventilation in particular, frequently then would ask a view from Health Facility Scotland, or to confirm that her position was in accordance with an HFS view, because I think she absolutely recognised that she wasn't an expert and wasn't an engineer. So it was really just to, I suppose, to sense check that from my point of view, that I hadn't missed something and that we didn't indeed have a record. And my recollection of that conversation is that she had no awareness that this was the position that, and how we'd arrived at that position.
Thank you. And just for completeness, there's one more email I'd ask you to look at in this chapter of your evidence, and it's in Bundle 13, Volume 8, page 449. And it's the email towards the bottom, the email from Janice Mackenzie of the 6th of July 2017. Do you see that?
Yes.
Again, this isn't an email that you're copied into at the time, but I think it's one that from your statement you may have come to see after the events. And it's really just for that observation in the penultimate paragraph that says, Infection Control have also confirmed they are happy with our risk assessment. Now, we've looked back at the risk assessment and you say you'd obviously discussed matters with Jeanette Rea-Richards. Was her understanding that there was any departure from guidance or any formal derogation for critical care areas?
No.
So again, should the inquiry view that statement in its context, which is the author of this letter thinks Infection Control are happy with the risk assessment, but that's a risk assessment that isn't actually formally signed by anyone from the Infection Prevention and Control team?
Yeah, my impression in looking at this is that perhaps that view was derived from the correspondence in January of 2017 with Ronnie Henderson, where this specific point is what Jeanette has confirmed back around cohorting and provision of a balanced or slightly negative arrangement.
Okay, thank you. Now, that's really all the detail I want to look at in terms of the project itself, and you'll be pleased to know there's really just a couple of topics that I want to go on and ask you about this afternoon. One is really to say you've obviously had a long time to think about the project. You worked on it until the hospital opened. Having had that time to reflect on matters, how do you think it got to that point? Like what went wrong so that the hospital didn't open as planned?
So I think my impression is that perhaps some of the processes within the project timeline perhaps lacked some robustness, and that's not a criticism of the people involved in the project. And I think it's perhaps reflective of the lack of clarity or a consistent, defined approach provided through various national documents, particularly around, I think, derogation from guidance. So where there is either a desired or identified deviation from guidance, really understanding then what risk assessment, what should be documented and who should be involved in that, and a slightly more formal approach to that perhaps. Again, my impression, and it's with the benefit of hindsight, is that perhaps some of the decisions appear to be made on a much more based on informal or email communication or discussion, rather than actually generating a formalised risk assessment that all parties then had an opportunity to comment on. I think, again, my impression is that Infection Prevention Control were they were a support, and it was a defined support rather than a dedicated support, because Jeanette's role for the period 2015 to 2018 didn't only include the Sick Children's project. So I think that was positive, and I think that was helpful to the project team, and I think they've reflected that. But my impression is that to some extent, perhaps infection prevention control as a component of the project team was perhaps slightly on the periphery. And certainly that's my impression from a lot of the correspondence that I've now seen as part of this. So where a position or a view of infection control is being offered, it's being offered up by a third party rather than an opportunity for somebody from the service to comment or confirm directly that that's indeed the case. So that feels inherently to me to be a bit of a weakness in the system. And I guess from my own involvement from early 2019 onwards, I think the speed at which or the kind of the availability of information in real time and being cited in things in real time improved significantly for Donald and I after the establishment of the ESG. I think we struggled again. I don't believe for any reasons of any malice or particular ill intent that where we were asking for information that didn't appear to be forthcoming. And so that, for me, creates an impression that perhaps we weren't seen as integral or a core component of the project and as a bit of a peripheral advisory service. And so I think there perhaps opportunity had we been actively involved in some of those key decision-making points, in its fullest sense, that would have perhaps helped to avoid some of the confusion or misconceptions I think that then seem to arise.
And would one of those key events be whenever Settlement Agreement 1 was agreed that fixed the ventilation parameters?
Yes, I think it would have been really helpful, perhaps from the board's perspective, to have a view from us at that point, because I think that would have been important in informing their understanding of risk and the risks that they were accepting, which I accept was for commercial and contractual reasons.
And in terms of trying to resolve that issue, if I just put it broadly as infection prevention and control being in the periphery, one of the innovations under SHTM 0301/2022 is the creation of a ventilation safety group. Are you familiar with that concept?
I am, yes.
Do you think that ventilation safety group is that going to address some of the issues that you've just alluded to in your evidence?
I think it will go some way to address that. I think it's we established a ventilation safety group in Lothian before the SHTM was published, and I think the scope and the remit and how that group actually functions is still developing. But yes, I think it provides a formal governance mechanism within the board with a level of distance and objectivity with relevant stakeholders who have an adequate knowledge and understanding of the subject matter to provide an objective view. I think it's very easy, perhaps, when you're very close to the detail of something, to allow a confirmation bias to creep in, and that you know what you think you know, and that what you think is right is right. I think the ventilation safety group gives just that objectivity, and it allows people who are not intimately involved in a project or an issue at an operational level to perhaps interrogate the information that's being brought forward and to interrogate the thinking, the decision.
Thank you. And the inquiry's heard evidence that if there was to be a derogation from guidance, that's the type of decision that a ventilation safety group would be involved in. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
But the inquiry's also heard evidence that there's not actually a standard form issued by the central NHS that would tell an IPCN working on the project exactly what they had to do, what they had to fill in, what specific evidence they needed. Do you see that lack of standardisation as still potentially being a problem?
Yes, I do. And I think particularly given that we've now got other processes that are looking to assure each stage of a construction project, it feels counterintuitive to me that there would be a national approach to assurance without some consistency in how boards were being asked to present or consider information.
And in simple terms, how could that be improved?
Could you repeat the question?
How could that be improved? So you effectively said there's a gap, there's a national system, but health boards have been asked to simply make up their own derogations. How do you improve that?
So I think the way to improve that is, I think, it would be helpful to have a template or a defined methodology that all boards were expected to follow to reduce the variation and the margin for error, because I think there are key pieces of information and there are key stakeholders who need to be consulted in that process. I'm very wary of the term signing off, but I think there needs to be evidence of consultation, and that I think the rationale and a written rationale to actually set out what it is that you're looking to do, why you're looking to do it, what risks may be associated with that, and how you aim to mitigate them. It's a fairly standard format, but that would appear to be a fairly logical thing to do, and certainly within the gift of national bodies.
Thank you. Other witnesses that have given evidence to the inquiry have suggested that another improvement might be to have more standardisation. So centrally to have standardised layouts and parameters for certain spaces within the hospital. Do you have any observations or views on that?
Yeah, I would agree with that, because again, there feels so. The example I think I would give is national treatment centres. Although the building work in Lothian has paused on that, there are national treatment centres being built across Scotland who will serve essentially the same type of patient population, in that they're an ambulant day case surgical population for elective surgery, so the risks around that patient group are fairly standard. I think the potential pitfalls and risks associated with getting design wrong, it feels like there's an opportunity perhaps for a standardised and approved design or set of criteria, or indeed suppliers or contractors, that could be worked up as almost a once for Scotland approach, rather than asking individual board project teams, including infection control, who will have varying degrees of expertise or skill or experience in this area, to come up with a solution that then has to pass muster against an assurance framework. It just feels a bit back to front to me.
And I think within your statement you say as well, if we're going to have a centre of excellence, and I'll come on to address NHS Scotland Assure in a moment, you think that having effectively a bank of what you think would be standard questions and standard responses would be quite a helpful thing for the individuals on the ground tasked with trying to deliver these difficult, complex projects?
I think so. I mean, if nothing else, it's an aid memoir to ensure that inadvertently people don't miss out a step or a question.
Thank you. Now, before I come on to ask you your views about NHS Scotland Assure, you tell us within your statement, I'll just read it out to you, I won't bring it up, it's page 149, paragraph 239, that you consider there's already insufficient numbers of qualified IPCN and IPCD to meet the demand of existing pre-pandemic clinical work and priorities. Can you just give the inquiry a flavour of how difficult is it to try to recruit and staff an IPCN function in a big health board like NHS Lothian?
So it's incredibly difficult. So in the team in Lothian, and not dissimilar to other teams, we are an ageing workforce. So many of us who've worked in infection control have worked in the specialty for a long time and are already at or rapidly approaching the age of retirement. And there have been, for a variety of reasons, difficulty in recruiting into the specialty. And And once you've recruited people in and retaining staff and ensuring that there opportunities for career development can be a little bit limited because it's quite a small specialty. So sometimes we bring people in, we train them up and then they leave because they can get a promoted post and award. It's a difficult specialty. I think people underestimate the range and breadth of what we do and the challenges around what we do. I think sometimes it's seen as an easy option, and it most definitely is not. So recruitment is a challenge, retention is a challenge, and increasingly succession planning is a challenge. So although we are now, so I'm nearly at my full establishment, the majority of my team are very new, so they're all experienced, qualified nurses, but they're very new to the field of infection prevention control. They're still undergoing an academic, completing their academic qualification. So they're not yet qualified as infection control nurses, and they haven't yet had time to consolidate and gain experience across the breadth of topics that we require to competently do our job. So it's a real challenge, and there have been incremental changes to the workload and the expectation on infection control teams for many years that have never then been matched with any investment in capacity or resource. So we've continued to absorb that workload, and really now we're beyond saturation point in terms of what we can deliver. But we're challenged in what we can deliver because we have an imbalance in what we would probably refer to skill mix, in that we've got a very small cohort of skilled and experienced and qualified ICNs versus quite a large cohort of staff who are still developing in the area.
I'll come on and talk about NHS Scotland Assure in particular, but really should the inquiry understand that any new system that's put in place, is it going to be very challenging to have sufficient IPC resource to implement that system, regardless of what it is, unless something's done about the recruitment?
I think that's right. I mean, I've already had to absorb back into my clinical line, for want of a better word, the post that Sarah Sutherland took up in 2019. So as that post no longer exists in our service for that and for some other reasons, because we were unable to fill those team lead posts to deliver the core clinical component of what we do. And that has to be the priority. So we've had to absorb or take away the resource that was available specifically for the built environment. And based on my understanding of the current ask of infection control services, we are currently not in a position to deliver that, and we will not be in a position to deliver that in reasonably the next 5 years.
And in relation to, if you did just bring in brand new staff members, would it be realistic for someone who was completely new to infection prevention and control to be working on the IPCN role for a big new build hospital?
Absolutely not.
And again, I understood you saying at the start of your evidence that the individuals that come to work as an IPCN, they would need some form of training, but that mandatory training wouldn't include any elements in relation to the built environment that might be relevant to water systems or ventilation systems. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's currently no mandatory requirement or component within the academic, the core academic component of the infection control courses that are provided through the University of Dundee and the University of the Highlands and Islands. And as yet, there is no definition provided nationally as to what training, what skills, competence, expertise would be required by infection control nurses to demonstrate competence in the area of particularly water ventilation, but the built environment in general.
And in relation to the new systems that have been brought in, Sarah-Jane Sutherland, one of your colleagues, gave evidence yesterday, and she said that one of her main concerns is she doesn't want to be a quality control officer. She didn't become an IPCN to sign off on plumbing. Like, is that the types of challenges that you have in terms of trying to recruit new individuals to come and work as IPCNs?
So I think it's one of the challenges. I think certainly from the existing team that we have, it's not an attractive part of the role because it doesn't readily align with the skills and experience that nurses have coming into the field of infection control. They are nurses, their skills and experience are around patient care and clinical issues. And there is a real, I think, and there has been an increasing anxiety and a recognition that if they're being asked to comment on something that they're not confident and they can't necessarily demonstrate either training or competence in, the consequences of that for patient care could be catastrophic. There are potentially significant issues for the board, but I think increasingly concern about what that means in terms of their own professional accountability and how that might impact on that for them as individuals. So I think to some extent, the focus on the built environment has become one of the reasons we're finding it difficult to recruit and to retain and to promote into more senior posts.
Okay, thank you. If I could just ask you some questions about NHS Scotland Assure. One of the things that's been brought in is the system of key stage assurance reviews. Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with that, yes.
Yeah. And do you have any practical experience of key stage assurance reviews?
So I have some experience, wasn't actually involved directly in the conversation, but we had a key stage assurance review for a project in NHS Lothian, I think around the end of 22, beginning of 23, relating to an infrastructure project which primarily focuses on the provision of high voltage electrical cabling and steam pipes. It's not a project that we had particularly much to do with. There was a stage 3 HEI scribe produced with the project team, noting issues around adjacency to active clinical areas, but really a project that we have no particular skills or knowledge in relation to. A key stage assurance review was completed with no input, interestingly, by an infection control specialist from NHS Assure, but the key stage assurance report was very critical of the infection control service. It noted that we weren't fully embedded as a member of the project team. It noted criticism that we hadn't completed all stages of the HEI scribe process, even though from my perspective, I can't find any questions in the stage 4 scribe that would apply. We were criticised for not having evidence of implementing the National Infection Control Manual, which doesn't apply. So it was very critical of the service, but I'm struggling to understand the relevance of having infection control embedded in a project around electricity and steam pipes.
And sorry, just that last comment I missed. You can't see the relevance of having IBC embedded in a project which
was primarily concerned with the provision of high voltage electrical cabling and steam pipes.
Thank you.
The inquiry in due course, we'll hear from the former Cabinet Secretary, Jean Freeman. Her idea behind the Centre of Excellence was that it was effectively going to perform a clerk of works role, so someone who would be coming in, doing inspections, physical testing. Is that what NHS Scotland Assure is in your experience?
So if I'm honest, I'm still not entirely sure I fully understand the role of NHS Assure in relation to some of these projects. It feels somewhat contradictory that there's an external scrutiny of the processes, which I think there is value in, but they don't have a scrutiny function. That's what we keep being told. So I think from a project perspective, yes, perhaps the role could be akin to a clerk of works role, but at arm's length, because again, my understanding is that NHS Assure don't involve themselves in the detail or any decision making around a project. It's really more about asking the project team to bring forward information for their review. From an IPC perspective, I think I'm still unclear what the role is or how that's anticipated to benefit infection control teams at board level.
And again, NHS Scotland Assure, its own documentation says that it's not going to be a decision maker, it's not going to take on any liability, it's not going to be acting in a regulatory function. Do you think that's the right model for a centre of excellence?
So I think it depends on what the function or the purpose of the Centre of Excellence is. I think if the Centre of Excellence is primarily concerned with providing guidance and undertaking research and plugging some of the gaps around our understanding or standardised documentation, I think there's a value in that. But I think, can you repeat the question?
It was really just the idea that the liability in decision making is still going to sit with the health board. That, as I understand it, NHS Scotland Assure in its own documentation says it's not going to be a joint decision maker, it's not taking responsibility, and it's not going to have a regulatory or enforcement function. And I was just asking you if you thought that was the right model for a centre of excellence, that it doesn't take any of the responsibility for the project, doesn't sign it off, doesn't inspect it, and doesn't have a regulatory or enforcement function.
So I think if the Centre of Excellence holds the body of experts with the skill, knowledge and competence to advise on what a compliant and safe design looks like, if, again, given that that expertise doesn't necessarily exist in every board, that feels like an area that the Centre of Excellence could actually provide a service towards. I understand that there's potentially a conflict in a body that provides independent assurance or some form of scrutiny function at the same time as being one that provides advice and information. There's potentially a conflict in that they could be then essentially marking their own homework. But I think given the challenges we have around workforce and given the challenges we have around capability, it appears that if the expertise is there, the benefit for NHS Scotland as a whole might be to utilise that in ensuring that what we're designing and building is safe and compliant.
Thank you. If I could just ask you to have in front of you, please, Bundle 13, Volume 7, page 327. And it's the email towards the bottom from yourself to Ian Graham on the 9th of June 2022. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it's just the last paragraph. You say, at least one board is thinking of advising Assure they are pulling the IPCT out of project work because of the concerns about what level of professional, personal and organisational liability might be associated with IPCT giving advice if not competent, and having no definition of what that means and not being supported. Could you just explain what did you mean by those comments in that email?
So I think so I can only talk from my own experience and the experience of my team in Lothian. I think there's a sense that we are simultaneously being told that we need to support projects and we need to be an integral and full-time part of that project, and we need to demonstrate competence. We've asked for a definition of sort of what would competence look like. So how can I as the associate director ensure that the workforce that I'm responsible for and the professional group I'm responsible for, how might I develop them and ensure that I can build those skills and we have that resilience and that we can move easily through some kind of assurance process, and that's not being defined. And I think the other point I think I'm alluding to is that where we have, as an infection control service in Lothian, asked questions of the IPC arm of Assure because there's a gap in the guidance or there's a lack of clarity. So an example, around the iPavilion project, we'd raised a question about ventilation into one part of that project. We raised the question in the June, and we didn't get a response until the October. And then that was a very brief meeting with the nurse consultant, who asked if myself and Donald had been consulted on the point, which we had raised through the project team to Assure. And then that was going to be taken back into Assure for an expert view. And eventually an email was sent with a not particularly helpful response in the December of that year. And the project director was already having to chase to say this is having an impact on project timelines. And the resulting action on the back of that was a suggestion that a short life working group be set up to provide the evidence and the expertise to inform that point. And Lothian were invited to chair that meeting. So additional workload as a consequence of a question we'd asked of the experts in relation to a gap in the evidence. So it comes full circle back to the board IPCT being simultaneously told we're not necessarily competent, we need to demonstrate competence, but equally being held up as the experts to support and develop national guidance.
Because again, in terms of a sort of question and answer function, a layperson might assume that if you have a centre for excellence, an IPCN in your position on a project could simply send a short email or lift the phone and get access to specialist advice very quickly and get your questions answered. Is that how NHS Scotland Assure is operating in terms of your understanding?
No.
And that type of system whereby you could get ready access to expert advice in relation to the built environment, would that be a helpful addition to try and ease some of the workload pressures that you've alluded to?
Absolutely.
If I could ask you to look to another email that you sent, please, this time Bundle 13, Volume 7, page 319. And it's an email that you're copied into, apologies, this time from Tracy Gillies. And you see it begins, so my understanding from LG on this.
Yes.
And then if we look to point 4, what she says is the usual advice and support on offer to boards appears to have moved to a more mark your homework approach. Do you see that?
Yeah, under point 4, yeah.
And is that how you would view what NHS Scotland Assure is doing? It's effectively just doing a sort of marking of homework?
That's it. That's our experience, I think, so far.
And then if we look to the final paragraph, Tracy Gilly says, given that we've already have to reduce HEI scribe attendance as there are simply not enough nurses and IPC to provide the essential service to clinical areas in the here and now, and not enough IPC nurses in Scotland with the requisite qualifications to do this more technical work, someone will need to feed back to SG Capital colleagues that their programme will be undeliverable. Do you see that?
Yes.
And again, would you subscribe to that view that really what the IPC function of health boards are being asked to do in terms of the new system is simply at a practical level undeliverable?
Yes.
And are you aware of any proposed changes being made by the Scottish Government to the new Centre for Excellence, NHS Scotland Assure, to try to address these types of concerns?
Not to the best of my knowledge, no.
And if I could actually just have your witness statement, please. So it's in Bundle 2. If we could look to page 156, firstly, paragraph 256. You state at paragraph 268, I've been asked if the NHS Scotland Assure and corresponding key stage assurance reviews will assist in involving IPC in new builds of healthcare environments. I think these new processes will provide limited benefit for board-level IPC teams based on the current approach. And then you go on to say the KSAR review process has primarily added a layer of external scrutiny over projects, although we've been advised NHS Scotland Assure do not have a formal scrutiny function. And then if we look over the page onto page 157, paragraph 273, you say, I am concerned that these new processes have simply created an unrealistic workload demand on boards' IPCTs, which is not matched with capacity or capability. In larger boards like NHS Lothian, where there may be multiple capital projects running in parallel, there is a risk that the NHS Scotland Assure processes are, in effect, setting boards up for failure. Do you see that?
Yes.
So does that accurately reflect your views, that albeit there has been the creation of a new Centre for Excellence, NHS Scotland Assure, in reality, these new procedures are simply setting health boards up for failure in major capital projects?
That would be my view based on the current approach, yes.
Just one more document I'd ask you to look at, please, and it's within bundle 9, and it's page 268. Bundle 9, page 268, and we'll have to zoom in at various bits. This might not be the easiest document to look at, but it's a document called an environmental matrix template, and this is a document that's been produced by NHS Scotland Assure. If we just look along the top boxes, you see that there's item room number, room name.
Yes.
There's then a term room function. Do you see that?
Yes.
So effectively what this document is, in relation to new hospital projects, there's going to be this document, the environmental matrix, that would be populated. And one of the items that has to be populated is this room function. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we look 2 along to the right, it also has clinical risk category. Do you see that?
Yes.
As an IPCN working in this space, have you had any guidance from NHS Scotland Assure in terms of how the room function or the clinical risk category is going to be categorised? Is there going to be standard forms that can be filled in, or is this something that an individualised assessment is going to have to be made?
So to the best of my knowledge, we've received no advice on what or how to complete that. And I guess my observation would be that in terms of clinical risk, there will be many clinical risks potentially, not all related to IPC. So again, I'm not sure which or collectively which clinical risks that might reflect.
Thank you. Obviously, in your evidence today, you've set out a number of views in terms of how these types of projects might struggle in the future, how that could be improved. Please don't think that anything that I haven't taken you to today within your witness statement won't be considered by the inquiry. But you've obviously had time, you've worked on the project, you've reflected on the project, you've had some limited involvement with NHS Scotland Assure. In addition to the issues that we've covered today and that you've set out within your witness statement, do you have any other further views in terms of how these large-scale new build hospital projects could be done better in the future to try to avoid some of the issues that cropped up in the RHCYP DCN project?
So I think from an infection control point of view, it would be really helpful to really pin down where the input of infection control services add value to the process, rather than, I think, the overall direction of travel, which appears to provide just an arbitrary requirement. And I think that would be really helpful given the capacity issues we have. I'm very thoughtful about the Centre for Excellence, or NHS Assure, in terms of the evidence base and to what extent existing sources of information and known issues. So I think many of the things that have been described or uncovered as part of this have been described in other countries. So in England, in the US and Canada, there are existing published case reports, guidance, which go through all of the same sorts of things. So to what extent we are seeking to learn from and adapt rather than reinvent the wheel around some of this, because it all feels like it's quite new and in the genesis of a Scottish resource. I do think there's a value in continuing to look at how the process becomes so I think more robust in terms of decision making. I think we've discussed that. But I think primarily it's about going back and understanding from an IPC point of view, what is the role of infection control and where does it add value? Because at the minute, it's not clear. And I'm also very thoughtful that we've had a lot of conversation this afternoon, and I've been asked to provide evidence around infection control education and training. I think there's been less conversation about what education and training is being expected of project teams, contractors, to actually provide some resilience and capability within those aspects of the workforce that support built environment or projects, because at the minute it feels like traction control somehow are possibly part of the problem, but seem to be a very large part of the solution, and that's not sustainable. So I would have thought it logical to explore where we can build capacity and capability, as I say, around infection control and understanding how some of the technical guidance from a technical perspective has a component of infection risk associated with it and how to mitigate that.
Thank you. Mrs. Guthrie, thank you very much for answering my questions today. I don't have any further questions. Lord Brodie may have some questions, or there may equally be application from core participants, but thank you.
There was one small matter of detail. You were answering questions this morning from Mr. McGregor in relation to the notion of safe, what's unsafe. And I think I noted you as giving an answer in relation to the old sick kids at Sheen's, and made the point that no mechanical ventilation was available there. And you, as I have noted your answer, you say, that doesn't mean it was unsafe. And then you mentioned something about evaluated. Did I pick you up correctly?
So I think what I was referring to is that in terms of being able to confirm or that there was no evidence that's too many negatives. So to evidence that the provision is safe, we can look at data through alert organism surveillance, so infection data, and through other surveillance programmes offered by, for example, the Scottish Infection Intensive Care Group, SICSAG. So there are patient outcomes which are measured, so things like ventilator-associated pneumonia, bloodstream infections, where those data are collected locally. It allows you to understand what's happening within your own unit, but it also allows you to benchmark against other units to identify whether you're an outlier in terms of your overall performance and safety. So from those measures, from those systems, there is no evidence that the sick children, the Sheens Road ITU wasn't safe from an infection control point of view, and it was not something that we had any particular concerns about.
Because it did not appear to be an outlier compared with other centres.
Yes, and I think based on ongoing surveillance locally, there were no signals from that data that actually there was anything of concern, and that was something that was specifically interrogated, I think, locally during the period where I think information was emerging from Glasgow. There was, I believe, one of the haematologists who had maintained over many years, actually, some surveillance around, I think, bloodstream infections. And we did look at that, I think, to sense check in Edinburgh whether we had missed a signal from our data that there was something happening in terms of patient harm, and that we couldn't identify and we had no concern.
Thank you. Now, Mrs. Guthrie, I appreciate we've taken a lot of your time. I'm going to ask for another 10 minutes just to allow Mr. McGregor to discuss with his colleagues whether there are any other questions that need to be asked. But I would hope we could get back to you in 10 minutes. So if you could wait in the witness room, please. We'll rise for 10 minutes to allow parties to consider whether there's any questions in addition. Mr. Gray?
No additional issues, my lord.
Right, thank you. Could you ask Mrs. Guthrie to come back? No further questions, Mrs. Guthrie, which means you're now free to go. But before you go, can I just emphasize my thanks for your attendance today in the midst of what I suspect is a busy day, and all the work that have been involved in preparing what is a long and detailed statement. I appreciate that will have taken a great deal of time and a great deal of effort and a great deal of research. I'm very grateful to you for that. You provided important evidence for the inquiry, so thank you very much. But you're now free to go.
Thank you.
Now, we're not sitting on Monday, Mr.
sitting on
McGregor,
Monday, my lord.
but we hope to sit on Tuesday beginning at 10.
Yes, Tuesday at 10, it'll be Dr. Inverarity. Tuesday at 10, and it will be Dr.
Tuesday at 10.
Inverarity.
And Dr. Inverarity. Well, and I wish everyone a good weekend.
And